Okay, it's 8:05. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm really excited to see you all. Welcome to the 9th session of Foreign Affairs with Future Leaders, presented by the Onero Institute and the Delta Phi Epsilon Professional Foreign Service Fraternity and Sorority. Foreign Affairs with Future Leaders is a series of youth-led discussions which analyze various international issues and topics by collaboratively addressing their most critical questions. And today, I am really pleased to be your host. Many of you know me already. For those of you who don't, I'm Elad Raymond. I am the founder and the executive director of the Onero Institute. And I'm really pleased to have a good friend and really wonderful speaker with us today, Francesca Edralin. And before we get started, I'm just going to go over some quick, just standard procedures, as I always do for those of you who've been to these before, and then we'll just get on the road real quick. So first, of course, please show respect for all peers and all topics discussed. Make sure to challenge yourself to keep an open mind in this discussion. Please approach the material professionally and analytically, and be sure to keep any questions pertinent to the discussion at hand. If you'd like to speak or ask a question, feel free to raise your hand using the feature by clicking participants. And please keep your mic muted unless it is your turn to speak. And when you do speak, we'd love it if you could just share your name and where you're calling in from. And I just want to make note that we're going to be recording this session so that anyone who wasn't able to attend will be able to view it later and learn about this really critical topic for our time and really for any time in human history. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our topic of discussion for this evening. Oceans cover roughly 71% of the Earth's surface. Whether we see it or not, the ocean and environment impact each of our lives every single day and are inherently linked to the survival of our communities. The ocean is also greatly impacted by the increasingly destructive consequences of climate change and large-scale pollution. Despite the centrality of the ocean to world affairs, environmental threats to our oceans are often left out of mainstream international discourse. In this discussion, we will dive into the importance of the ocean to international affairs, the evolution of environmental threats to the marine environment and global responses to them, recent developments and the challenges facing our oceans, and the role of young people in ocean and environmental issues. As I mentioned, today we are pleased to welcome Francesca Edralin to our program. Francesca is a junior at the George Washington University, majoring in international affairs with a concentration in international environment studies and minoring in journalism and sustainability. Francesca is passionate about the intersections of international affairs, environmental politics, and sustainable development. At GW, Francesca is the co-president of GW UNICEF, works for the university's sustainability department, and is highly involved in the Philippine Cultural Society. Francesca has completed internships at the Council of Foreign Relations, USAID, and now conducts research on environmental conflicts in Southeast Asia for the State Department. For this event, Francesca will be representing Think Ocean as our director of global outreach. Think Ocean is an international nonprofit committed to connecting young people passionate about the environment around the world with chapters in 20+ countries worldwide. Thank you so much for joining us, Francesca. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and yeah, we'll go ahead and get started if you're ready, Francesca.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction, Elad.
Just give me 1 second. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can. I
Perfect.
assume everyone else can too. So hi,
Excellent.
everybody. Yeah, thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm Francesca. As Elad mentioned, I'm the Director of Global Outreach at Think Ocean. And the overall premise of my presentation tonight will be on the inclusion of ocean and environmental issues in international affairs. So to just give you a brief overview about Think Ocean, which is the organization I'm representing tonight, we were founded in 2017, and we are a youth-led nonprofit dedicated to promoting awareness, policy change, and engagement through a global network of chapters at high school and colleges in over 20 countries, including the United States, Canada, Germany, France, India, Cameroon, and the Philippines. And we work to spark action among our generation to protect our planet and connect various grassroots environmental and ocean conservation movements from around the world. And so first, a brief overview of why our oceans really do matter. So as a lot mentioned, ocean environmental issues are currently largely omitted from international affairs discourses, which is a concern just because of the rise of climate change and rising sea levels. We will definitely see the effects of climate change on international affairs issues. And ocean issues are very prevalent in everyday life, especially when you live near a coast or near an ocean, and most cities. And in fact, 71% of the Earth's surface is comprised of oceans. And so there really should be more discussion on oceans. And ocean issues, of course, aren't just isolated within itself. They're related to and reflect many manifestations of climate change. And so my discussions today about oceans will also largely intertwine environmental and climate issues. And so just an overview of what some of these ocean issues look like. They include overfishing, plastic pollution, rising sea levels, increased tropical storms, ocean acidification and coral bleaching, dead zones, oil spills and drilling. And I'll go into some more of these in depth during this presentation and talk more about how they are affecting specific countries around the world. And so I'll kind of dive into case studies of different countries that represent different geographical regions and are experiencing different climate conditions. And so 3 out of these 4 countries think ocean actually works very closely in. So I'll talk about our work in these countries as well. And so we'll start off with the Philippines, then talk about Cameroon, Italy, and the United States. But of course, these are just 4 countries, and ocean issues and climate change are prevalent in all countries around the world. And so this is just a very small taste of the ways that climate change are impacting countries worldwide. So to start off with the Philippines, I picked the Philippines just because I come from there. So it's a country that hits close to home. And my interest in climate and environmental issues actually stemmed from learning at a young age that the Philippines was going to be one of the countries most hit by climate change as an archipelago of 10,000 islands. And so they definitely are suffering from ocean issues today. For example, parts of Manila, which is our capital of the country, will displace millions of poor people with no place to relocate, as it is predicted that the city will likely sink in the next 30 years. Also, the Philippines also suffers from major typhoons and storms yearly. Most recently, while we were all worried about the election, my family members in the Philippines were worried about the typhoon that hit them, Typhoon Rolly. It's actually the strongest typhoon of 2020. And according to the UN, around 70 million people have been affected by this typhoon, and 24 million have been living in the worst hit areas. And so this is not a unique occurrence in the Philippines. This happens yearly where because it's an island nation, they are constantly being hit by tropical storms, constantly having to rebuild their infrastructure. And because the Philippines is a very poor country to begin with, it's very difficult for them to really recover, and they'll be impacted for a long time recovering from these storms. And then also ocean acidification, which is exacerbated by climate change, is a major issue in the Philippines, especially because so many of the local fishing communities rely on fishing as their source of income, and ocean acidification leads to lower fish populations, as well as overfishing in general. And the Philippines is also surrounded by coral reefs, and coral reefs are super important for marine life and communities. And bleached coral reefs have also been climate change has been killing coral reefs at a very concerning rate over the past 50 years. And now I'll discuss Cameroon. So there's not enough data about Cameroon specifically, but one of our national coordinators, Paris, he works very closely in plastic pollution advocacy in Cameroon, especially because there really isn't much international attention. And so you can see by these photos how his local community and many local communities in Cameroon are covered in plastic bottles because of really, really poor waste management systems. And so Paris has worked really hard in trying to spread awareness and gain international attention on the plastic pollution issues that Cameroon faces. Some of his photos and videos have blown up on social media because so little people know about what's happening in Cameroon. And a lot of the development work and humanitarian aid that happens in Cameroon and similar countries. They don't focus on plastic pollution, so it's really up to the citizens of these countries to demand better systems from their governments, because their water systems are polluted so poorly due to plastic, they can't drink water directly from their streams. They're only able to consume water from plastic bottles. And so they're in this feedback loop of being stuck in this plastic loop. And it definitely is affecting their waterways, their systems. And it's something that definitely needs more international attention. And Think Ocean has been working hard to spread more awareness about it. And now I'll talk about Italy, which is another country that Think Ocean works heavily in. As many of you may know, Venice is currently sinking, which is quite concerning as a coastal city. In fact, Venice has sunk 9 inches in the past 50 years, and they're battling flooding and rising sea levels, which is quite a struggle. It's also a major tourist city. In fact, the centerpiece of Venice, St. Mark's Square, now floods more than 60 times a year, and the National Research Center of Venice predicts that in 50 years, this kind of flooding could occur with nearly every high tide. And so if you could see by the photo in the bottom right that this city constantly is experiencing floods, which is definitely a concern as a major tourist city as well. On the flip side, another issue that Italy is facing due to climate change is the melting of their glaciers up in their northern region. Our Think Ocean team in Italy actually filmed a documentary over the past year that highlights how communities are being impacted by the melting of glaciers. As many people often think that ice melting only happens at the poles, but they don't realize that there are communities right now in Europe and in many alpine areas that are worried about what's going to happen when the glacier right on top of their community is going to melt. And so this also causes climate displacement and water pollution. And it's definitely a concern for Italy that not enough people know about. So if you're interested in watching Italy's documentary, I could definitely send that link afterwards. Cool. And the fourth country I'll be talking about is the United States, which is very fitting because most of us do come from the US. In the United States, a major issue is sinking coastlines, and especially in areas like the Gulf of Mexico and Florida. And in general, in fact, America's sea level has risen by 6.5 inches since 1950. And it is projected that 13 million people in the US could be forced to relocate by 2100. And particularly in Miami, an organization called Resources for the Future actually calls Miami the most vulnerable major coastal city in the world, with hundreds of billions of dollars in assets under assault from winds, storm surges, coastal flooding. And so you'll definitely see in states like Florida, a lot of their money will have to go to battling climate change. And it's definitely an economic concern. It'll displace communities. And it's very close. And it's a city that's very close to many of us. And of course, Miami isn't alone in this. Virginia Beach, which is much closer to many of us right now, lives in DC, is also very at risk of rising sea levels, and as well as the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf Coast. Many of these cities are most impacted by rising sea levels. And that also kind of leads to the issues of intensified and more frequent storms. As we can see, the increase in hurricanes and tropical storms happening over the past several years have been very much concentrated in this area. If you look at the map in the top right corner, you can see that definitely southeastern of the United States is definitely where you see the most amount of cyclones and hurricanes, which is definitely a concern for this region of the country, especially with the amount of money that must go to relief and humanitarian efforts. And then lastly, ocean acidification is also a common theme here. Many of the fishing communities and fishing industries in the US are being hurt by this, most particularly in the northeastern region of the US. Over the past 80 years, the northeast region of the US saw 34% decline in sustainable catches. And so there are also many economic concerns here. And you could see that fishing industries, not just in areas like the Philippines, but also in the US, are worried about catches due to climate change and ocean acidification. Yeah, so just to tie together some common themes after talking about what's happening in these 4 countries, rising sea levels is definitely a big one. Most coastal cities are worrying about rising sea levels over the past century, which is also scary because that's also where the most people are populating these countries. They're economic hubs, cultural hubs. So that's very concerning. And research estimates that 150 million people around the world could be potentially displaced by 2050, and 300 million, the number will rise to 300 million by the end of the century if climate change is not mitigated. an example of right now, currently countries considering relocating cities and their capital hubs is in Indonesia. Jakarta currently is in Java, but they're rebuilding their capital city, which will now be in East Kalimantan. And while the government is able to relocate their buildings and their government offices, all the millions of people who live in Jakarta are left to kind of be stuck in a city that will be sinking. And so you see issues like this, and it's definitely going to be a common theme in the century to see more cities looking to relocate their capital cities. And in general, you could see from the map on the right that the people who are going to be most affected by sinking lands will be in Southeast and Eastern Asia, but they're not alone in this. You also see similar trends of rising sea levels and climate displacement in the United States, Brazil, and in Northern Europe. Another common theme is ocean warming and acidification, as I kind of explained in some of the case studies, especially with the fishing industry. It was recently discovered that 60% of fish species will be unable to survive in their current ranges by 2100 if climate warming reaches an increase of 4 to 5 degrees Celsius due to less oxygen being available in warming ocean temperatures. And so, as I said before, although we might not personally be able to relate to it, many areas in the world, fishing is their main source of income. And so we'll definitely see some economic impacts of that. As also ocean acidification also greatly impacts coral reefs, which also coral reefs play a very significant role in oceans in the livelihood of various species and maintaining that biodiversity. And so it's predicted that by 2030, 70% of coral reefs around the world will disappear due to climate change and ocean acidification. And so these are some issues that are happening underwater, but we'll definitely be seeing the effects above ground economically for sure. Cool. And then the last common theme that I'll be talking about is ocean pollution, especially in the forms of oil spills and plastic pollution. And so the Deepwater Horizon spill was the world's biggest ocean spill, and that happened a couple years back. And that spilled 160 million gallons of crude oil along 1,300 miles of coastline in the Gulf of Mexico. So many of us have heard that in the news, and the area is still recovering from that and all the biodiversity loss in that area. More recently, many of you might have heard of the oil spill in Mauritius that happened over the summer. And while it wasn't as detrimental as the Deepwater Horizon spill, it was very, very harmful for the country of Mauritius, as they are a major biodiversity hotspot. They do not have the infrastructure and the funding to be able to clean up the oil, so a lot of international aid needed to be sent in the area, and the devastating economic impacts will be felt in the country for decades to come, which is really sad because a lot of oil spills happen in countries that do not have the same infrastructure as the US to help build back their economy and their ocean ecosystems. On the flip side, another major issue is plastic pollution, and as American citizens, it'll be shocking to hear that hundreds of thousands of tons of plastic is actually shipped from the US to poorer countries, especially in Southeast Asia and South Asia and Africa. And so this is really sad because these countries already don't have the infrastructure, as kind of with the example of Cameroon, do not have the infrastructure to manage their existing plastic waste. And these are the countries already suffering from plastic waste the most. And so Western countries, I know countries in Europe as well as the United States ship hundreds and thousands of tons of plastic to these countries yearly, and these poorer countries develop accept the plastic because they need the funding, but this only makes plastic pollution issues like I've talked about in Cameroon even worse in these countries. And I wanted to kind of emphasize in this presentation, while I only talked about 4 specific countries, the effects of climate change on our oceans and our environment are really seen everywhere, and no country or region in this world is left unharmed. And climate change impacts every region of the world, just in different forms, whether it's ocean acidification or rising sea levels. There are many ways that climate change manifests itself. So understanding that you won't see the same issues in every country, but every country is going to be affected differently. And that's the scariest thing, is that everyone's going to have to find a way to mitigate and adapt to climate change differently around the world. So kind of shifting and talking about how we've seen already a shift in discourse at the policy level. Many of you might be international affairs students and are interested in working at think tanks. And gratefully, a lot of think tanks that produce really great research have been starting up bureaus or more offices that focus on environmental research and including environmental research in international policy discussions. I interned for the Council on Foreign Relations back in 2019, I believe, and they did not have a climate change department. I definitely would have applied there had they had one. But actually a semester after I left, they started up a climate change department, which was really cool. And to see a place that I worked for and admired so much start to include that kind of research in their work meant a lot to see for sure. And other think tanks in DC have been also starting up environmental programs such as the Wilson Center, CSIS, in the State Department as well. That's currently where I intern. I've seen a lot of really, really cool projects, especially in OES, which is the Bureau of Ocean and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, very long name. That department has been doing some really great work in tying links to COVID-19 and environmental issues and ocean issues. And I've been able to work on a project that specifically focuses on environmental conflicts in Southeast Asia. And so I've been able to do some really cool research, and I'll be presenting to embassies later on in the school year about some of the findings that we have. And so it's cool that they're trying to also include students into these research and policymaking discussions, so they understand that youth provide a really important perspective in these issues. Also, the United Nations, the UN Environment Program, has been around for around 3 decades or so they're not as new, but it's really cool to see the work that they've been doing as well as the World Bank, because now economic institutions are realizing the grave intersections of climate change and economics. And so the World Bank's Climate Change Knowledge Portal has a lot of really great information, and they're producing a lot of really great information on climate change. So there's also, you see a lot of shift in discourses within the advocacy level as well. It's really inspiring how in the past 5 years or so, I've been very interested in this kind of stuff since I would say middle school. And I remember not many people really talked much about climate change or understood its impacts, but now you see a lot of high schoolers protesting on the streets, talking about it more. So it's really great to just see on a cultural level, more people are starting to care about the issues of climate change, and they're understanding that it's not a partisan issue. It affects all of youth. So you see a lot of youth, on the streets regardless of their political affiliation. Some really great organizations that have been doing some cool work are Fridays for Future, this is 0 Hour Sunrise Movement, and you see some cool events also happening, like the Youth Climate March. I know before the pandemic, there was a really awesome march. I think it was in September of 2019 that I participated in. I saw lots of other GW students participate in. And so it's really great to see kind of the youth running their own movement themselves. Starting their own kind of events and protests. And they're really the ones demanding change. And I like to think that these movements that the youth have started have really increased international and domestic policy attention to environmental issues. Cool, and that's it for my brief presentation. I believe I'm answering some questions after, but thank you for those who listened, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them later on in this session.
All right, well, thank you so much for that, Francesca. I think you really put a lot of things that just need to be discussed into a great presentation. That was, some of these facts and figures literally blow me away every time. I may have heard them before, but it just stuns me every time to just think, wow, this is where we're at right now. This is what we've come to, and also, the fact that climate change it's been going on for some time, but now we really see it present everywhere. These constant storms we're getting, these everything that we've mentioned is very much in your face more than ever before, and it's only going to continue. So I think it's really wonderful to not only have someone like you to be able to speak about it, but that we have so many wonderful people who clearly show that they care about this issue and that they want to hear more about it and learn more about it, and how we can incorporate it better into IA discourse. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a few questions that I put together, because this is a topic that I'm quite curious about. And after I do that, I love to give the opportunity to everyone, all of you participants, to ask your own questions. And so you'll be able to do that just by raising your hand in the participants feature, or you can send a message to the chat. But I'll go ahead and get us started. So something that you mentioned towards the end there that I really think is super critical to fighting the climate crisis, and really to a lot of aspects of international affairs. In fact, it's the part of the point of the O'Neill Institute and of Think Ocean is getting young people more involved in these discourses and making sure that young people have a role in issues such as this. So I just wanted to kind of pose the question to you on why you think it's so important for young people from around the world to be conscious of and actively engaging with ocean and environmental issues.
Yeah, for sure. That was a really great question. The reason why I've become really passionate about climate change, I think it's really that issue that affects all of us, regardless of where you come from or your political affiliation. Everyone will see the effects to some extent in their lifetime. Many of us have already seen the effects. And especially as the young people, we're the generation that will be hit the most because when we're adults and we're policymakers, climate change will be much, much worse than it is right now. And so I think it really is in our hands. And we see the young people being most concerned because if you're older, you probably will not be able to see those effects as much, but it's us as the rising leaders, we're the ones that will have to deal with the economic impacts, the climate displacement issues due to climate change. And so it's been really refreshing to see that people no longer see it as like oh, if you're this party, I believe in it. And they're not, people realize this is science. This isn't something, climate change doesn't care what your party affiliation is. It will affect everyone because it's really just accepting the science, seeing how it's already impacted countries. If you're not seeing it yourself in your local community, then, go, if you ever travel somewhere else, I think when I really saw the issues of climate change, it wasn't based on what I saw right outside my window. When I was in New Jersey, it was green everywhere. It was when I traveled and I talked to people living on the ground and telling me that, they were no longer to make a living in whatever profession they were doing because there was a drought or there was flooding. And so it's really seeing that like so many people around the world are being affected. It's not just one country's issue, it's everyone's issue. And I think young people really play an important role with that because they understand this will affect all of us. And so I think like just normalizing conversations about climate change, understanding like, some of the things that we see every day, like for example, I remember, I believe it was last winter, it did not snow in DC. That was not by chance. That was global warming. Or today, for example, I think it was like 75 degrees in November. You see these increasing trends of, yes, they're not as detrimental to our daily lives. Like we're still able to function normally, but like these are signs that climate change is happening. And we're lucky enough that many of us don't experience like our livelihoods at risk right now, but there are many communities where that's not the case.
Absolutely, and I think that you've kind of hit on an important point about kind of normalizing it in the dialogue, because a lot of what we talk about when it comes to addressing climate change is like on macro levels, is huge, kind of unfathomable issues. But it really does start on the individual level, I would argue at least. And so I want to kind of ask you a quick follow up. And how do you think efforts in addressing these issues on the individual level could be more collaborative than it already is?
Yeah, for sure. I think really touching on the point that it's an issue for humanity. It's not like, I know it's, with like the elections happening, it's so heated to talk to someone who might have a different political affiliation from you. There might be a debate on that, but the issue of climate change really should not be debated because the science clearly proves so. And I remember researching when I was younger that the Republican Party is actually the only major political party in the world that denies climate change. And it's not because the science isn't there, it's because of the fossil fuel money that pretty much controls the party. And so it's really understanding that this is an issue that affects us all and that there really isn't, you can't really deny the science here. And I think really just normalizing the conversation is really big. I've just seen a lot of efforts of people wanting to become more sustainable regardless of, your background. And that's really great. But then also understanding it's a lot of the corporations and at the very large scale level that are responsible for carbon emissions. And so understanding it's not really like the individual's fault. It's more just like the systems and the structures that have been placed in place over the past century and the rise of industrialization that have caused this. So it's not like a party versus party kind of issue. It's really just like the issue of how the way that companies have been able to get away with carbon emissions and that lack of accountability. So I think individuals should collaborate more in holding companies more accountable, trying to be more sustainable, advocating for policy change, because it's really something that will affect all of us.
Yeah, and I think, no, thank you for raising that. I think that that's a great segue to what I wanted to ask about next, in that, we talked about the individual scale and you've kind of widened it out for us and added some perspective. We talked in your presentation about different kind of think tanks and nonprofits that have been acting, but a big deal when it comes to regulation and dealing with larger corporations are state actors in this state-driven international system that we live in. And so I just wanted to ask you, as environmental security is becoming more central to security questions, like we mentioned, how do you anticipate state actors are going to need to adjust their approaches to ensure their own security in the face of environmental challenges?
Yeah, I think at the forefront, one of the main things is really understanding the severity. And so seeing these statistics, understanding that phenomenons that we see around the world, for example, with the relocation of Jakarta in Indonesia, understanding that if you're by a coast, that might be the same thing happening to us. So I think it's really kind of understanding the way that climate change manifests itself around the world and seeing that you might be safe right now, but this will be a factor for sure in so many security issues. I know I talked a lot about climate migration and climate displacement earlier in my presentation, but I feel like that's one of the biggest things where I know the refugee crises around the world are huge, but there will only be more, especially with all these communities being forced to displace because of rising sea levels. And so understanding that climate change kind of in a way is an actor that will inevitably kind of impact security issues, and really taking climate change seriously as a significant player and influence on the security of these countries, and just normalizing it in conversation and better understanding the ways that climate change is already impacting countries around the world, so that other countries who have not been hit as much yet can be better prepared just by seeing the trends already.
Right. And, as this crisis continues to progress, I mean, it'll just become more and more central to a lot of the other interests that have kind of been deemed independent of this crisis up to now. So, we'll continue to see that. And I think it'll be very interesting to see the way that national policy for various states around the world will adjust. Shifting gears a little bit, though, to international policy, we'll call it. As you know, the Paris Accords are very central to this conversation. It's become a buzzword in some ways. I think like people love to mention it and kind of throw it around, but it still represents a very important piece of international policy in that it takes climate change head on. And so I just wanted to ask you, to what extent does international policy like the Paris Accords actually make a difference in mitigating these effects?
Yeah, of course. It's definitely not a direct impact. I think it's more of the accountability systems, and you kind of unifying the movement worldwide of fighting climate change that policy like the Paris Accords play. Because, of course, depending on the country, you see that certain countries are taking climate mitigation way more seriously than others. And so while, of course, the Paris Accords tries to standardize the ways that countries try to mitigate climate change, there definitely is a variety, and it isn't just involvement in the Paris Accords that is like the base. It's just really a base level there. And so I think one of the most important roles that I think the Paris Accords has played is really just like the cultural emphasis of around the world, across the board. It's important that countries prioritize mitigating climate change in their policy strategy. But at the end of the day, a lot of these countries, the Paris Accords don't have the strongest accountability and enforcement systems in these countries, which is what I was talking about before, the importance of civil society and citizens to also hold their governments accountable, because it's also a really important lens how kind of like in the top level, laws like the Paris Accords kind of set that high level of why this is important, but like on the opposing end, it's the citizens and it's the civil society and it's the advocacy movements that I think oftentimes are the best ways that governments could be kept in check, because with almost all countries, in the Paris Accords right now, there's only so much that the laws itself can do. So I think it's kind of like the two sides of the spectrum that equally play an important role. And I know, kind of talking about like with current events, of course, many of you might know that Donald Trump has decided to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accords. And while that faced a lot of backlash, many people also questioned if that would really, with like the U.S.'s involvement in the Paris Accords, would have made that much of an impact on climate mitigation. And then Biden has agreed to make sure that the U.S. goes back into the U.S. Paris Accords, and a lot of people have considered that the U.S.'s involvement in that isn't really like the sole factor of how well the U.S. will be able to mitigate and adapt to climate change. It's really just at the government level, how much the government wants to help. So I think the Paris Accords is really just the baseline level. It kind of institutes the idea that all countries should be working towards this. Of course, the wealthier countries who are responsible for our carbon emissions are definitely more responsible than the poorer countries who, of course, don't have the same infrastructure. So I do like how the Paris Accords understands that some countries are definitely way more responsible than others. But it's definitely really up to the governments and having some civil society actors keep those governments in check that I think really makes that difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I would certainly agree with that. And I think the Paris Accords may be especially relevant to our program today, which focuses on climate change and on oceans, but specifically on how they are incorporated into international affairs dialogues and discourse. And this is, in my opinion, the biggest role, because when you have an organization like the UN, where the level of authority is as not being at the state level is a little bit difficult, right? So that kind of cultural awareness is just really huge across the board when it comes to that kind of thing. But absolutely. So I just have one more question before I open up to questions from the rest of you. I'm really excited to hear them. But so we spent a lot of time talking about oceans specifically, and of course, as oceans are so central to climate change, that is certainly that certainly makes sense. But there, as we mentioned, this issue is not, it can't be set into a vacuum, right? It applies, all over the place. So could you speak to some of the other most pressing intersections of climate change and global affairs, like forest issues and others, and just shed some light on those as well?
Yeah, of course. So I like how you brought up forest issues, because deforestation is also a major issue. That's what I particularly do research for the State Department about, with climate change. And people might not understand that the cutting of forests at the very large rate that many countries are directly contributes to climate change, because rainforests are a major carbon sink in the sense that trees absorb so much carbon dioxide. And so what do you think about it, like for forests like the Amazon rainforest with so many trees, they're absorbing so much CO2. So the cutting down of these forests actually directly contributes to climate change, because when the forests are cut, the CO2 is released back into the atmosphere. And so while it's interesting, because while deforestation within itself is an environmental issue of just cutting down trees, displacing indigenous communities, it also directly impacts, the environmental destruction also directly impacts climate change. I think kind of tying on that too, I know that a lot of people who care about the environment are also very interested in the role that cutting down meat consumption plays, because the animal agricultural industry plays a very significant role in adding carbon emissions. Cows emit methane, which is a greenhouse gas that's 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And it's interesting because I don't think many people realize how much land is not only cut down, but also cut down to not only raise these cows, but also to raise the food that is given to these livestock like cows. And so there's lots of resources if anyone was interested in the role that animal agriculture plays. But it's definitely a movement that I think has been gaining more attention, but I don't think people understand how grave of an impact animal agriculture plays in adding carbon emissions into the planet. Another interesting thing too that I think directly involves all of us is the fast fashion industry. It's a lot of these large scale industries that contribute a ton to climate change. And so while I think international actors and state actors play less of a role in trying to regulate these industries, I think it's an important role where individual actors can play in demanding change from these companies. A lot of fast fashion brands, due to the fast fashion industry, use a lot of environmental resources. Their factories produce a ton of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And so a lot of these issues, even though the production itself might not directly take place in our backyards, as consumers of meat, some of you might be, or consumers of fast fashion brands, those are direct ways that we could indirectly be complacent in the climate crisis. And I think that while of course maybe like not stopping to buy from like a fast fashion place or selling meat won't make that direct impact, I think the most important role is holding these companies more accountable and increasing accountability systems in that way. Of course, I believe that government should find a way to kind of play a role in holding these companies more accountable, because they are international companies. It's harder at a country level for this change to happen. I think it's more of the demand from consumers.
Very well put. Thank you for tying that all together for us. So now I'm going to open up to questions from the audience and other participants. So feel free to go ahead and raise your hand or send a chat to me if you have a question. We already do have a question that that someone sent in the chat. So thank you very much for doing that. And it ties into a question that I asked you earlier, but I'm going to ask it and adjust it a little bit to see if you can go a little bit deeper. So this question is asking about the role of supranational organizations like the EU, like the UN. And so I'm wondering if you could perhaps speak a little bit more deeply about the way that they specifically are able to have the impact that we mentioned on perspectives and on the cultural awareness of climate. What how the connection comes to be And if you even want to incorporate other non-governmental organizations into this, like non-governmental organizations as well, feel free to do that in your answer.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting because particularly in Europe, there are a lot of efforts that specific Europe governmental organizations are playing in trying to mitigate climate change around the world. So yeah, with the United Nations, it's really great that the UN Environment Program isn't just working in isolation, and that the United Nations includes a lot of its direct international work, whether it's the UN Development Program or the UNHCR. They all of them kind of consider climate issues into their work as well. And so while the UNEP might be the main hub for environmental discussions, it's definitely not in isolation. So I think the UN does a really good job of including climate change in all of its discussions. They've done a lot of really great climate assemblies around and climate conventions around the world, which bring in actors from all over the world that represent different kinds of groups and perspectives. So I think the UN has done a really great job outside of just the UNEP of kind of centralizing conversation about climate change. And it's interesting because one example of a Europe governmental actor that's been doing some really interesting work regarding climate change is NICFI, which I believe is it's in Norway. I know Scandinavia does a lot of really good climate work. They're very ahead of the game with this, and they've been doing a lot of really great work. Also, partially because they've contributed a lot of emissions historically. So I think it's just a way for them to kind of give back. But NICFI is there, kind of like the equivalent of like a US aid in Norway. And what they've been doing is they've started this RED Plus program that funds developing countries to limit their deforestation. And so I think they have a bunch of other funders and partners as well, and some banks help fund their work. But they're an example of a government actor that has not been only trying to kind of hold fellow European countries accountable, but also trying to help and support other countries in entirely different parts of the world in their efforts to kind of mitigate climate change and reduce their emissions. But I think it's a really cool example of kind of just the international collaboration, that it might not just be like an international organization itself, but maybe just like a government institution that has a strong interest in mitigating climate change. So they understand that, like, regardless of whether or not it happens in, let's say, Indonesia, where the emissions happen, it's gonna, the effects will be seen worldwide. And so they do a lot of really cool work in Brazil and Africa, in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, on funding countries in their climate mitigation efforts. So that was a cool example that I thought of organizations that aren't necessarily international in their scope, but they're trying their best to really embrace the collaborative efforts of mitigating climate change.
Thanks so much for that answer. So I see we have another question from Felipe. Felipe, if you want to unmute and introduce yourself and ask your question, go ahead.
Yes, hi, I'm Felipe. I'm a junior at George Washington University, studying international affairs with a focus on Latin America. I guess my question goes more towards the future of the sea levels in the United States. How do you see, of course, we see in the Trump administration a lack of support towards climate change reform with the Paris Agreement. How do you see local municipalities working towards that effort? If, for example, in California, or for example, in areas such as like Florida and Miami, have you seen any efforts in the local level towards achieving administrative effort outside of the executive branch?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you play, because of course, if the executive administration really fails to focus on climate adaptation, then it really is up to the cities. And I know Miami, when I talked about Miami earlier, they're one of the cities that are most impacted by rising sea level. And I think I watched some documentary like a couple of years back of their climate mitigation efforts, and I think they're constructing some sort of like dam or levee to help prevent the flooding when hurricanes hit Miami. And they're doing a lot of reconstruction, of relocating coastal communities inwards and really helping and funding this. So they've invested, I think, billions of dollars in this effort to reconstruct the city to be more climate adaptable. And so, well, I've talked about the idea of like climate mitigation a lot, and like preventing the effects of climate change. Another kind of branch of that is climate adaptation, and how cities are adapting and reworking their current models. So I know Miami for sure has been doing work. I know there are definitely conversations in smaller coastal communities on ways that they can help mitigate climate and adapt to climate change. I believe that in Virginia Beach and in the Chesapeake area, because they have a lot, lot lower like fish supply, they are considering other, so it's not really directly an infrastructural change, but considering different avenues of income. And so you'll also see in smaller, poorer fishing communities some sort of efforts to relocate the source of income, understanding that climate change will kind of impact their main source of income, whether it's fishing or crabbing of some sorts. So Miami is the one that came to mind, but I'm sure that there are also other cities that are considering ways to restructure their setup. But I know Miami is doing a lot of really cool work with that right now.
Great, thank you, Francesca.
All right, looks like we have another question from Claire. If you want to share, or I'm also happy to, I can actually go ahead and read it. So just this question is about free riding and climate action kind of as a public good. So she's asking, what are the tactics that international organizations can utilize to make sure mitigating climate change is addressed equitably?
Yeah, so I think it's been really great that with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been a rise in the conversations of environmental racism, especially in this country. And I think I follow a good amount of environmental organizations and social media. And I think social media is honestly probably one of their main tactics to engage with citizens and people who don't necessarily work professionally for these organizations. And so I've definitely seen an increase in conversations about environmental equity and the intersections of the Black Lives Matter and racial movements, and those intersections with climate movements. I've also kind of seen the work of Black environmental activists be amplified in social media. I know that I've seen a handful of posts that dedicate their posts to talking about this is the really great work that these environmental activists are doing, and they really do their work through an environmental justice perspective, which is super cool. So I think that, being honest, I think most of us can probably see this too. Social media is one of the most powerful tools that environmental organizations use to engage people like us, young people who are not in the professional environmental workforce yet, which I think is really great because it's increased kind of like normalizing these conversations. And I think that they also are using that in the way of environmental racism and raising concerns about how we can dismantle issues with environmental justice and spreading awareness. And then you see too with protest movements, back when protests happened before COVID, you'd see a lot of intersectionality and understanding how the feminism movement and the racial justice movement and the environmental movement, they're all very, very intertwined because it's the same kind of systems of oppression that, there's a reason why Black communities in the US happen to be placed right next to factories or landfills. And so, and due to that, they grow up with their air more polluted, have more water crises, they're at risk more of public health. And so you see a lot of these intersections. And I think a lot of the advocacy movements as well have understood these intersections that, I don't just advocate for racial justice, or I don't just advocate for female rights. I advocate for like female rights, like racial justice, like climate justice, because there is such an intersection with all of them.
Absolutely. So just really quickly before we move into our last session, and of course, if anyone has any more questions, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand. I just wanted to ask quickly, we talked about some great case studies, and of course, you mentioned, rightfully so, that these are only 4 case studies, and this really impacts everyone. And I'm really glad that you chose to include that. So are there any other specific kind of cases that are happening right now that we should be keeping our eyes on, that perhaps are underrepresented in the media or haven't really been given the attention that they deserve? And if you'd like to just share those with us.
Yeah, for sure. I think a region that is definitely most impacted by especially ocean issues in particular is the French Polynesia area, the islands in the Pacific that really don't get much media attention because there are such small populations there. And so I tried to encompass that in my explanation of the Philippines because they're also an island nation. But the Philippines is, a combination of like around 10,000 islands. So it's like one island's gone, they still have all these other islands. But for countries that are just one island, I've just seen a lot of documentaries about how those countries are especially impacted because their livelihoods are just on that island. And so the idea of like relocation there, if you're an island nation that is many miles away from the next island nation, how do you get to that next island nation? How would you even know? Do you have the technology or the mainstream global attention to draw like international aid to the environmental crises that these countries are facing? So I think definitely island nations in the Pacific are suffering, I would say, the most at an exponential rate because of their location and because they really do lack the infrastructure, and they're a single island. It's definitely the hardest for them. I would say too that kind of outside of ocean issues, deforestation is another major one. So I talked about it a little bit in the Amazon, but I think especially in South America as a whole, deforestation is a major, major issue. Also in the Congo Basin, in Africa, because I think I touched upon Africa, but more of Western Africa. So this is more of Sub-Saharan Africa, and also in Southeast Asia. These are also environmental conflicts that don't really get much media attention, but definitely contribute a lot to carbon emissions in the country. And there are plenty more. I think it just manifests in different ways. Droughts, and so it's not, singular to one region of the world, but all these farmers, I think one of their major issues that farmers around the world are suffering from is how do we adapt to drought? With less water, feeding our crops, do we have to find a new form of income? And there are obviously economic consequences to that as well, and how it affects supply chains around the world. So those are just some of them, but there really is so much out there happening due to climate change that I unfortunately can't cover it all in a presentation. But I encourage you all to do more research, and you can check out Think Ocean's social media platforms as well if you want to look more into the work that we're doing specifically.
Absolutely. And if at the end of the event, Francesca, you want to drop that in the chat box, that's totally fine as well. And I would also encourage you, if you didn't get a chance to, some of the readings that we sent out with the link are just really, really wonderful if you want to just read up more on this and learn some more. Those are some great resources. But now we're going to move into our last session as we're starting to run out of time. And something that we like to do at with Foreign Affairs and Future Leaders to kind of engage with everyone and make it more of a discussion is do a little bit of a debrief at the end of our talks to just kind of see what stuck out most to people. What are people are still kind of very curious about, what lasting questions you may have. So if you feel comfortable just sharing what you thought, like what your main takeaways are, and how this may have changed your perspective a little bit, feel free to raise your hand, and I'm happy to go ahead and get us started. So this is, of course, climate change is becoming more and more present within our field of international affairs, and I'm very happy to see that. I'm kind of seeing more of more writing and more presence of this issue in kind of more mainstream fields. But I think my big takeaway from this is I'm going to need to go and actually seek out these resources and this information, just because as much as it's kind of entering the field and kind of entering the discourse, we have to be a part of bringing it into the discourse. And that's what the point of this kind of event is to take an issue that we all recognize to be very important, but to actually talk about it and challenge us to speak about it and to think about it in ways that we don't if we're just kind of reading an article through and saying that was a great article. So I think just talking more about it and looking more for resources is going to be my biggest takeaway. And also just thinking a little bit about climate migration is something that I'm particularly interested in. I'm interested in migration overall, and seeing more and more how that is going to impact not only the countries that people are migrating from, but the countries that people are migrating to. I mean, this is already a dilemma that's happening, and it's only going to continue to happen. And you're going to see, enormous numbers of people migrating from various aspects of climate change, whether it be drought or rising sea level or whatever it may be. And this is going to present a serious security issue and just humanitarian issue moving forward. So I think that's what's most intriguing to me, and I'm really thankful for this event with you, Francesca, to be able to learn a little bit about this and to kind of spark my interest to dive in any further. So if there's anyone else that would like to share some thoughts, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand. But if not, and Francesca, if you want to just give us some of your takeaways from your experience, leading this event, of course, we're very appreciative of that. And yeah, just any kind of lasting words for us.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. Yeah, this is an issue that I think I've particularly been interested in because I've had some kind of ties to my home country and seeing how it impacts my home country and my family in the Philippines. And I think what I've kind of seen is that people tend to care more about climate issues once it kind of hits their home and it directly affects them. And so if you don't necessarily see the impacts of climate change outside right now, I ask for you to maybe do research, see how other, maybe family members from around the world, or other people are seeing the impacts of climate change, because it's very interesting to see how it's kind of creeping its way around the world. And so different countries are being impacted right now, some that might be closer to you than you may think. And then at the same time, how our futures will inevitably be impacted in the future. And so it's interesting, when I was kind of younger, like in middle school and high school, when I talked about climate change, people really were like, what, they would honestly like make fun of me for talking about it. They wouldn't understand like the impacts of it. And then now I see these same people posting about climate change and the Paris Accords and their Instagrams. I'm talking about climate justice, and it's like, oh, you came around, you see now. And I think that in the next couple of decades, you're just going to see an increase more on discussions about climate change and environmental issues. And so better to start early to understand it now, because I really think that, especially for people who want to go into international affairs, it's an issue that will only have increasingly more importance, and definitely be a threat to international and security issues. And yeah, it's really just like, it's our planet. It's just about like humankind and just our species being able to survive, because of course the earth can survive without us, but we cannot survive without this earth. And so it's really like, it's so core to, I think, just human existence and livelihood, the issue of climate change, which is why I personally care so much about it. And I hope that others, are more interested and want to do more research about it as well. And so for if anyone was interested in connecting after with my organization, we are just Think Ocean Global. That's our Instagram handle. We usually use Instagram. If you do want to chat with me specifically after this call, I don't know why a lot about, when I type in the chat, it doesn't I can't send a chat to like everyone, but you could follow me.
I just sent the link. I just sent the link to everyone.
Okay, sounds good. You can email me at fedralin@gw.edu, or follow me on Instagram or something, and I'm happy to chat more.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. And before we part ways, those of you who've been to these events before know that we love to kind of take a group picture at the end. So if any of you feel comfortable turning your cameras on, of course, only if you feel comfortable, I'll take a photo of us, and then we'll be on our way. So I'll just give a second for anyone who feels bold enough to to share their faces with us. We'd love to see you. And again, we really, really, truly appreciate you all for joining. Thank you so much, Francesca, for taking the time to speak with us and to share your perspective on this. And I know that you will continue to work hard on this issue, and hopefully we'll all continue to work on this issue. But yes, I'll give another couple seconds for anyone who wants to turn their camera on while we take this quick picture. All right, I'll go ahead and do it now then.
Sounds good.
Got it. All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much. I'm quickly going to paste some information in the chat for anyone who's interested in learning more about the organizations that put this event together. But thank you all for joining us again. Thank you, Francesca. And we look forward to seeing you again at our future events. We have an event next week on Sino-Indian relations with Dr. Deepa Olapalli. So we hope to see you there. You can find that on the Onero Institute website, oneroinstitute.org. And beyond that, I hope you have a wonderful evening, and take care, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone who attended. It means so much. Thanks, everyone. Bye.